We are really pleased to have you join us for the first California Current Acidification Network, or CCAN, Ocean Acidification Roundtable Discussion of 2018. The title of today's presentation is Forecasting pH and Aragonite Saturation State in the Pacific Northwest, Progress and Needs. This series is hosted by CCAN. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of Terry King, our CCAN chair, in rallying to start this series up, and also Diane Pleschner-Steele, who maintains our CCAN correspondence. In short, this series is intended to create a direct dialogue among industry members, natural resource managers, and scientists, the seated folks around that round table, within the California current ecosystem. With awareness of and access to research and its applications and uses, participants will be able to collaborate better and to better understand and to adapt to ocean acidification moving forward. Okay, hang on here. This is our title, hosted by CCAN. I'm your moderator for today. My name's Jan Newton. I'm an oceanographer at the University of Washington. I'm a member of the CCAN Steering Committee, and I'm looking forward to moderating this for you. We also have Shallon Bush from NOAA online, who will be running the logistics of the webinar. All right, here's the format for today's webinar. During the presentation, attendees will be in listen-only mode. You're welcome to type questions related to technical issues or questions for the presenter into the question box at the bottom of the control panel on the right side of your screen. Hopefully you see it there. We'll be monitoring incoming questions and we'll respond to them or pose them to our speaker. We're going to have 3 talks today that you can see there by Parker, Samantha, and Joe. At the conclusion of each talk, we will ask 1 question to each speaker as we transition, but then we will anticipate about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this all for questions and discussion. We are also recording this session and we'll share the recording on the CCAN website. Well, today we are really excited to have Parker MacCready, Samantha Siedlecki, and Joe Schumacker speaking with us. I have to say it's been my pleasure to work with each of these people over the years, and this panel represents people who understand both the science and management needs relevant to ocean acidification and are actively working on that interface. While today our focus is on ocean acidification, we know that other issues like reduced oxygen, hypoxia, and warming temperatures, harmful algal blooms are also key to our ecosystem. And what is exciting that the tools and approaches that will be shared with you today address these as well, providing a realistic ecosystem context that spans across these variables. So I'd like to introduce our panel, our speakers. First is Parker MacCready. He's a professor at the School of Oceanography at the University of Washington. He's a physical oceanographer. He has strong expertise in both estuarine and coastal ocean processes. It's that knowledge that has enabled him to make realistic numerical model that we'll hear about today that captures the features that make our coastal area here in the Pacific Northwest so diverse and so dynamic. Parker has worked with biologists and chemists so that this work can extend beyond to help frame the dynamics of issues like ocean acidification, hypoxia, and HABs. Our second speaker is Samantha Siedlecki. She is a biogeochemist also working on coastal dynamics with a focus on interdisciplinary processes controlling carbon dynamics, which is pretty much literally everything. Though she spent many years here at the University of Washington, she's now faculty at the University of Connecticut, as you see here. But fortunately for us, she remains highly engaged in Pacific Northwest projects, a couple of which you'll hear about today. Beyond her scientific skills as a modeler, Sam has also spent considerable efforts to work with managers to understand what forecasts, what data are needed to improve research management and the forecasts themselves. And I have to say that both Parker and Sam have worked very hard to verify model forecasts that are well validated against observations, something you'll hear about today. But the best model is not useful if it's not understood or applied. And working on this interface is our third panelist, Joe Schumacker. Joe is a marine resource scientist for the Quinault Indian Nation. Joe spends considerable time working in partnership, as you can see on this slide, with several groups, because he knows that the needs of the Quinault people will only be met if we have strong science underpinnings, respect for what treaty rights are, and the ability to work together to forge wisdom from that all to guide resource management. And I just have to say, I have such high regard for each one of these people, their knowledge, their approaches, and it's truly an honor to introduce them to you to share the information that they have. So with that, I'll turn the controls over to Parker to lead us off.
Thank you very much, Jan. Can you hear me? You're all muted, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, but I can hear you.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, and that saves me a lot of work because you did a great job with that. So I'll be speaking today about a specific model called Live Ocean, and it's focused on short-term forecast. It's a daily forecast model of biogeochemistry in Pacific Northwest marine waters. One of my main colleagues working on developing this model is, of course, the other panelist, Samantha Siedlecki, and she in particular is responsible for both the oxygen and carbon chemistry in the model. And then also we work with Ryan McCabe, who is quite expert in observations on our coast and a lot of dynamics as well, and heads up the validation part, comparison with observations. And then Neil Banas is the architect of the ecosystem model that is contained in there. He's now at the University of Strathclyde. So, describing Live Ocean, it's you can see the domain of the model in the map on the right-hand side of the screen, and what's shown there is surface salinity. In its current state, it goes from close to the Oregon-California border, up includes all of the coastal waters of Washington, the inland waters of the Salish Sea, and also the Columbia River, and then a portion of Vancouver Island. It is motivated by, and in fact funded by, two different applied science issues. The first one I highlight here is the desire to make short-term forecasts of aragonite saturation state and pH of the waters entering shellfish growing areas. And this one is, you could think in particular of the Washington coastal estuaries, Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. If you can see my mouse on the screen, there's Willapa Bay, and above it, Grays Harbor on the coast. And they are important shellfish growing areas. In fact, something like 1 out of 8 oysters consumed in the United States comes just from Willapa Bay. So it's a large resource, and one that is known to be affected by low pH and especially low aragonite saturation state of the waters there. So it's sort of the canary in the coal mine of ocean acidification. The model also makes short-term forecasts of phytoplankton blooms and especially surface water advection. And this is motivated by a desire to forecast the arrival of harmful algal blooms at the coast. So we know that there's a couple of places where Pseudonychia species bloom and become toxic offshore, and we're looking to make short-term forecasts of when those come ashore and close down the razor clam harvest. The model system is something called ROMS, that stands for Regional Ocean Modeling System. It has in the inland waters and on the shelf about a 1.5 kilometer horizontal grid size, and it's realistic in every way possible. That is, it has tides, it has rivers, it has realistic atmospheric forcing, both winds and surface heat fluxes, and also the open ocean boundary conditions are they're as realistic as possible. And I'll speak in a moment about the data sources that inform the model in that way. The primary result that is currently coming out of the model, and has been coming for the last year or two, is 3-day forecasts of all the physical variables like currents, temperature, salinity, density, but also biogeochemistry as represented by the variables we abbreviate as NPZD, or nutrients, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus, and also oxygen. And then a couple of carbon variables, in particular DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, and alkalinity. And from those two, you can calculate pH and aragonite saturation state. And as I said, Samantha Siedlecki is responsible for the carbon and oxygen variables in this system. The forecasts, so you can think of the model as it's really focused on making high quality short-term forecasts at the same time scale as the weather forecast that you get on your phone. And these forecasts are available daily on the web through the NANOOS NVS, that stands for NANOOS Visualization System. And NANOOS is one of the regional associations of IUS. I strongly encourage you to check out their amazing website, and I'll show you an example of that. There's also, in terms of its contribution to the harmful algal bloom project, we do automated particle tracking. I'll show examples of that, or an example of that, and that contributes to a HAB bulletin that's put out as part of the MERHAB project funded by NOAA. And we also put a great deal of work, probably half in terms of our effort, into validation of the model, that is comparing it to observations. The model is run continuously from January 2013 to essentially the day after tomorrow, and we validate with a wide variety of data sources. In terms of the forcing, the atmospheric forcing comes from a regional, relatively high resolution weather forecast model run by Cliff Mass called WRF, or WRF, Weather Research and Forecast. And that is the primary limitation on the length of the forecast. It runs, we get the forecasts that go out about 3.5 days. We use them to make 3-day forecasts. And because the surface waters that are so important to what gets to the coast are so strongly influenced by winds and storms, the ability to predict those with any accuracy becomes more limited, as we all know, as you get further out in time. So that's one of the limitations of a model like this. We also get ocean boundary conditions, especially temperature, salinity, and sea surface height, from a thing called HICOM. That's a global data assimilative model. And because it's data assimilative, it does not stray very far from observed properties of the ocean. For example, the salinity profile in the water offshore looks quite realistic, and that's because it's getting information from Argo buoys offshore. It has a number of rivers, and those are gauged, and then the tides as well. Here's an example of the model fields from today's forecast. This is the surface aragonite saturation state in the model domain as visualized, and this is something you can go and see yourself right now, is through the NANOOS NVS, the NANOOS visualization system. And the amazing thing about this NVS is that it allows you to look at a whole variety of models, not just live ocean, but another one run by Alex Kurapov at OSU, and several others, including HICOM, the one that we nest inside of. Here you can see lowest aragonite saturation state coming because of the chemistry of the Columbia River, tends to come out with low alkalinity and high DIC, and that creates relatively corrosive waters that then flow to the north during this time of year and flood into the coastal bays. One issue with this model is you can see that even though it makes predictions in the Salish Sea, we don't present them for biogeochemical variables. That's why it's blanked out up in the Salish Sea here. And that has to do with inadequate model resolution, but that's the thing that we're working on this year, and I'll show an example of that. You can see data using the NVS at different levels and for a number of different fields, as you can see listed on the left of this panel. Here's an example of that particle tracking. So this is a type of plot that's produced every day automatically and put in, you can see the URL at the top of that screen, the PM2 blob core windows. That's a place in the cloud where it's using Azure, the Microsoft Azure cloud storage system. And so we automatically send a movie up there, a 3-day movie of particle tracks from known HAB initiation sites to that, and then you can download it. Anybody can download that movie using a URL where you just format the year, month, and day to be the most recent day. In terms of validation, I'll just present 2 examples. Can you tell me how much time I have left? I forgot to keep track.
Parker, you have, I think, 4 minutes.
Okay, I'll get going. I'm almost done. So this is an example of some of the, especially the carbon and other biogeochemical fields in the model, just looking at casts made by NOAA offshore at the 3 circled locations. So these are in deeper water. And this plot shows those model data comparisons. Each of the rows is 1 cast location, and then each of the columns is a different variable. Then the black line with circles is observations. These are from bottles typically. And then the red is the ROM's prediction. This is in 2016, so the model has been running continuously and freely. It doesn't have data assimilation itself. It's been running freely and integrating forward since 2013. And so the model biogeochemistry has had a long ability to adjust and develop errors or not. In this case, the 4 columns are alkalinity, TIC, or same as dissolved inorganic carbon. And the 3rd one is oxygen. 4th one is nitrate. You can see, for example, as you get into deep water, say in that top plot with oxygen, there's the oxygen minimum zone around 1,000 meters, well-known feature of the Northeast Pacific, and that's represented quite well in the model. I could, a lot of information about these fields comes from a regression against salinity that we use to inform the open boundary conditions that come from HICOM. Another example of validation that's more important for the coastal estuaries comes from OCNMS moorings, and OCNMS stands for Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. They operate about a dozen moorings in relatively shallow water off the northern half of the Washington coast, and they tend to operate in summer. Here is, in the bottom, is a time series from a location in about relatively shallow water, just 15 meters of water, and off, I think, Cape Elizabeth. And then that's data for a whole year from the model in gray and from the observations just during the summer in black. This is oxygen. And you see the model does, in this one, biased a little low, gets the events very well. And that's sort of typical of the skill with oxygen. Sometimes you do better, sometimes worse. And then here's other fields, temperature and salinity from that same location. You can see it does quite a good job in these shallow water places near the coastal estuaries of representing the variation and the magnitude of temperature and salinity. We have hundreds of these comparisons, and these ones are typical. Then finally, I'll finish by showing what comes next. We're actively developing a new grid. This has 500 meters grid size, so 3 times finer resolution in the Salish Sea and Strait of Juan de Fuca, and also finer in the coastal estuaries. And then we've added many more rivers. Instead of 16, we have 45, and we've extended the domain somewhat north to south. And the goal of this new model is to do a good enough job with the physics that in the Salish Sea that the biogeochemistry is also well represented there. and likewise for the coastal estuaries. And then this would be a suitable model for nesting even higher resolution things inside of. And then this is the last slide. I would just say, in terms of needs, going into the future, any time series of carbon variables are extremely valuable, and they're starting to be taken more commonly, but they're not as common as the other time series now. Higher resolution, like this model, really pushes the ability of what we can do, but with the computers, but we're getting better at that. River chemistry is a big data need, and then also more information about benthic influences on biogeochemistry are going to be important as we move more and more into shallow water. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parker. That was excellent. We have a question while we're switching the presenter, and it's from Andy Lanier, who says, great work on the model. Any chance of extending the model results south to cover the full state of Oregon? Yes. Right now, this new model actually goes down to 42 north, so it does include the whole state of Oregon. Of course, none of California, because that's right at the California-Oregon border. The main thing it's doing to do a better job with Oregon is that it includes a lot of rivers that are south of the Columbia River. So about 8 or 10 of the Oregon rivers, which we know are extremely important for shaping transport and salinity near the coast, especially during winter storms. There's other groups working on this up and down the coast. It's I could talk more about that, but yeah, that's what I'm doing. That sounds great, Parker. Thank you so much. Okay, so I see Samantha's slides are ready, so over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks so much. Can you guys hear me okay? And it sounds like you can see my slides, so that all sounds good? You're good. Great. So thanks again, Jan, for that wonderful introduction. And Parker, you did a really nice job talking about live ocean. I'm going to talk about a different forecast system now that's called JScope, which is a seasonal forecast system. And when I say seasonal, I mean it goes out 6 to 9 months into the future. And for that work, I've been working with folks over at Northwest Fisheries Science Center, including Isaac Kaplan, and then also people at GSAO, which is where this project started, Al Herman, Nick Bond, Emily Norton, Jan, who's moderating this and leading this webinar. You heard she's at University of Washington, Simone and Dick, who are both at NOAA PMEL, Nina, who's now at SQUIRP, and Cheryl Morgan and Jennifer Fisher have been working with us on some data comparisons down in Oregon. Okay, so let's see. No? There we go. So just to start out with, we are all familiar with ocean acidification, I think, on this, but just as a background to point out that there's a lot of variability, right, in the depth of the aragonite saturation horizon as well as temporally. And we really expect to see the lowest, most undersaturated waters in terms of aragonite saturation state during the summer, during that upwelling season in the Pacific Northwest. So that's highlighted here by this time series from a mooring in Oregon off the coast of Newport. It's in a paper from Harris et al. 2013. And also by this, right now pretty famous figure from observations that NOAA made along the west coast of the U.S. And so that just shows you the shallower locations that are the depth of the aragonite saturation horizon. So when they're shallower, it's red, and when it's blue, it's deeper. And so you can just see there's a lot of spatial variability in addition to this temporal variability here. And so this is a challenge for these forecasts, is trying to sort of represent both that spatial component as well as that temporal component. So what we're trying to do is to, have this kind of nested set of tools we're calling a forecasting toolbox. And so you can start with these, this is just a cartoon example using oxygen, but you could imagine pH here. These real-time data observations coming in through these portals that that Parker just talked about, and that Jan is the director of, like NANOOS, for example, is one of the IUS portals. You have these real-time observations coming in, and you can imagine sort of an early warning system of when those, and in a lot of cases that's happening, where you have these moored observations that are, you know, surpass some threshold, get too low, and then emails go out or something, you know, some kind of warning goes out that that's happening right now. And then into the future, you can imagine two different timescales or multiple timescales of forecasts. One being, in this case, the example being live ocean, which has like a daily 36-hour kind of forecast system. You just heard Parker talk about that. There's also WCOFS, which is in the works, which is the West Coast Ocean Forecast System. So that's a short-term forecast. And then something going beyond that, like in this case, a seasonal forecast, kind of giving you not the event scale for, you know, but sort of an idea of what this season, next season is going to look like. Is it going to be higher or lower than it was, and how does it relate to the time period beforehand? I'm really relying on these IUS portals to relay that information. So what is needed to build a regional forecast system? There's a list now that's been, it's in the literature and work that I've done, but also work that's coming out of Australia, where their seasonal forecast work has been around a bit longer than it has on the West Coast. And then Desiree Tomasi wrote a really nice paper about it. And so the list includes things like an observational network with this real-time data access, because we're going to be continually testing this, and it also helps to build trust with these new tools with the community. Then working hindcast simulations, so if you can't simulate this variability in the past, you can't really expect to be able to go forward with it in the future. Predictability and some of the important physical forcings for your region, in this case winds, and one example of that is to show that sea surface temperature has had predictable skill. A stakeholder group that has been needs identified, metrics of uncertainty, which we're constantly working on improving all of this, but this was kind of a compilation, and then of course continued testing, because these are works in progress. So building the seasonal forecast system, we start with the climate forecast system, which is boundary conditions. It's a global model. It's really coarse resolution, and we put inside of it this this nested higher resolution domain, a Cascadia grid, which was developed by the UW Coastal Modeling Group, and that Parker the same domain that Parker just discussed. But again, driven by a different physical forcing system, which is this global system called the Climate Forecast System, which is from NOAA. And that forcing from the Climate Forecast System goes, 6 to 9 months out into the future. They have multiple forecasts a day. It allows us to have a large pool of forecasts to draw from. And then there's some empirical relationships that we've been developing in order to take those ocean conditions and make a specific targeted product for particular organisms. So Isaac has led a paper talking about the sardine habitat, which is how JSCOPE started. There's currently one that Mike Malik, who's a postdoc working at Northwest Fisheries Science Center, with Mary Hunsaker and also Isaac and others, is working on for hake. There's one that Emily Norton and Susanna Officer, who both working with me, have been working on for crab, from crab larvae, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then we have just gotten funded to do some work on adult crab, which I'll just show one slide of. All right, so JSCOPE is JSAO's Seasonal Coastal Ocean Prediction of the Ecosystem, and there's a website that you can check out, and a paper that came out in 2016 with lots of validation as comparisons that Parker was talking about. And just an example of what one of those forecasts, if you went to the website, might look like. This is an example of sea surface temperature. So we have, this one was an April initialized forecast. So you see into the future, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. These are 2-month averages, and they are anomalies. So they are relative to an averaged time period or a climatology. In our case, that goes from 2009 through 2014. And so what this tells you is that this forecast, which is from April of 2017, forecasted that we would see warmer than average conditions over the preceding 7 years. So especially in the early part of the season. And then it would kind of go more towards climatological, maybe a little bit cooler even as you got into the winter. We try to provide some uncertainty with that. And so in this case, we have maybe not the best example because the models tend to agree, but because we run a mini ensemble, so 3 different forecasts for each one of our forecasts with different forcing conditions, allows us to say how well do they agree. And so if there's 50%, then that's the highest uncertainty that they don't, that there's a lot of uncertainty. In this case, they tend to agree quite well amongst themselves. And then we also do a lot of validation as well. So this is an example also from the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, there's a map here showing you this one mooring location from CEO 42. CEO 15, this is the one, Cape Elizabeth, that's where Parker showed you. There were comparisons there. And so this is just a little bit further offshore, a little deeper. And what you see here are the January initialized forecasts and the blue and an ensemble mean, and then the red is the April, or the observations, and this light blue, sorry, is the April initialized forecast. And this is out now for bottom oxygen, and this was for 2017, so I'm showing you now like how well we did for last year's forecast. And so in general, this forecast did a really nice job. We don't have observations yet past mid-September, but anecdotally, the low oxygen water did continue well into October. So April forecast did a pretty good job with this oxygen. We also compare to the NOAA CAS, like Parker showed you as well. This is a different way of looking at it, similar to the opening slide from Dick's paper from 2007. So on the left here, you see they're both maps of the depth of the aragonite saturation horizon. So again, red being shallower and blue being deeper. And on the left, you see the forecast. There's a 5-month forecast, a January initialized forecast of May conditions when they were out on that 2016 cruise. And then on the right, you see what they actually observed and experienced. And so there's, the model offshore is a little bit, here you can see it's a little bit too shallow. So we know that bias exists a little bit, but in general, the higher, more shallow aragonite saturation horizon close to the coast was well captured by the forecast 5 months in advance. So we do some more rigorous testing in terms of predictability. And so here you can see this is from that paper from 2016. We have 3 different variables. And what we've done here is just tell how well do the anomaly from the forecast agree with the anomaly from the like a hindcast, which is the closest to reality simulation, when we knew what happened and the forcing knew what happened, as opposed to a forecast when it runs into the future. So when you compare those, you get an idea of how predictable the variables are. And on this left-hand panel is sea surface temperature, and the right 2 are deep variables, so bottom temperature and bottom oxygen. Anything that's highly red is that's what we say has scale, means that the anomaly compared well from the forecast to the hindcast. And so one of the conclusions we drew from this work was just that these deeper variables did better, which we don't have a long enough record to do aragonite saturation yet with it, but we're working on it, and we expect that it to follow bottom oxygen. But that the deeper variables have more predictive skill on the seasonal timescales than the surface variables do, which makes sense for several reasons, which I'm happy to talk about with folks. But some of those include, some biases associated with clouds and with the surface winds, and some memory, essentially, that the deeper ocean provides. Okay, so then we're trying to take this work and bring it into biological indices. So that was all about the ocean conditions, and now so in terms of OA, there's 2 that we have results for. One of them is, as I mentioned, we have the sardines and hake, but now I'm going to talk about the OA ones. And so that specifically, the first one was pteropods, and that was some work that Nina Bednarczyk published last year, where we released particles within the model domain Al Herman had written this particle tracking code, and those particles then were able to move up and down with vertically and migrate as pteropods are known to do. And he ran them backwards in time for 30 days to sort of see, you know, from releasing them from the point where they were observed and collected as part of the cruise. And he saw, and then those exposure history tracks, is what we call them, were then put into analysis in Nina's paper, where she compared it to the probability of survival in the lab and found a significant relationship. And so basically the prior undersaturation days, that the previous undersaturation days that the organism was exposed to did impact their survival in the lab. Similarly, we're also working on comparing to some historical larval distributions that Cheryl Morgan and NOAA Fisheries and also Jennifer Fisher have been sharing with us. And so that record allowed us to develop a generalized linear model using the ocean conditions from the model for the habitat of these crab megalopi, which is a larval form. A picture courtesy of Casey Sanger here, which 4 years later they develop into the crabs that we know and fish and eat. And so what we found, Susanna Officer and Emily Norton worked on this GLM over the summer and into this fall, and they found that 3 variables did a good job of predicting the presence or absence of these crab megalopi, and those included salinity, temperature, and aragonite saturation state averaged over the surface 30 meters of the water column, which is the depth interval with which they vertically migrate. And so we tested that in 2 years that we did not use to make the GLM to forecast, and found that, you know, we did a decent job anyway with those, and are still working on improving that. And then just one new work that we got funded by NOAA's MAP program to aid the crab fishery, and Joe, who's going to be speaking next, and I are going to be working together on that, along with a host of others, including Dan Ayers and Kelly Corbett. And for that project, we're working on quantifying the relationship between the local environmental ocean conditions and 3 kind of decision-oriented metrics for the crab fishery, one of them being meat quality, which helps them decide when to open the fishery, some spatial variability in the crab catch and abundance, and then likelihood of summertime hypoxic events, which all have management decisions surrounding those. So we look forward to reporting back on that work later, and how much ocean acidification ends up playing a role within that story. So just to wrap up, my key messages: regional forecasts of ocean conditions have measurable skill on both weather and seasonal timescales. Parker showed you on the weather timescale. And these are for variables specifically that are relevant for management decisions for fisheries, protected species, and ecosystem health. Forecasting efforts are aided by a strong relationship with local stakeholders and these real-time observational networks from the beginning. We definitely need, especially folks on this call's help. Expansion of forecasted fields to include OA indices allowed us to develop decision-relevant indices of environmental exposure. And long-term monitoring is essential to establishing these kinds of relationships between the co-location of these environmental conditions and the biological observations. Well-validated models can also be used as well in the absence of long-term historical data, but in general, we like to have those both together. So I just want to acknowledge my funding sources, which include NOAA FATE, NOAA OAP, and NOAA MAP, and encourage you to check out our website for more information, contact me with any further questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. Very comprehensive. We have one quick question. From what you have seen both in Live Ocean and in JScope, do you know, Dick Feely asked, does upwelled coastal corrosive water get into the coastal embayments like Willapa Bay?
Yes, it does. It depends on if you mean, you know, connected. Is it connected like a pipeline all the way out, you know, past 200 meters off the shelf? You know, we haven't done that kind of analysis in the model, but certainly oceanic water does make it into these outer coast estuaries. if that answers, hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, that is the answer that we're looking for,
okay,
and
great.
that was my impression as well. And I think it's important for people who may not have studied these outer coast estuarine environments to know how important that oceanic exchange is. Okay, so we'll have more questions later, but we're going to switch over to our third presenter, who is Joe Schumacker. And Joe, we'd love to hear from you from the management, resource management perspective, your interest and utility of these forecasts and other perspectives that you would like to share with us. So over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, real good. Thank you all, and thank you, Samantha and Parker, both. Those are great presentations on these forecasting models. We appreciate it so much. I want to welcome you all to, from my place where I'm at right now, the mouth of the Quinault River out here on the coast of Washington State. I work for the Quinault Indian Nation and have for darn near 20 years now. And we manage the resources, the treaty resources, within a legally defined area of the ocean. And this area today is what I'm going to be discussing primarily, though there's many more areas that we manage as well. We manage rivers, estuaries, etc. within that area. If you look at the map in front of you, you'll see that it shows a small box there off the coast of Washington State outlined in yellow. And that's the legally defined treaty area of the Quinault Indian Nation. I drew a quick little hastily drawn black line inside of that that shows where a smaller area within that box that where we primarily fish Dungeness crab. And then along that shoreline adjacent to that, we also harvest Pacific razor clams as well. We harvest and manage many species within this area. The area is driven by strong upwelling offshore. It has fantastic productivity that supports many of the species that we have historically harvested and currently manage, and supports the great salmon runs from our rivers along this coast as well. Many of the factors that Samantha was just referring to, including in the question that just came up, including estuarine influences, riverine influences, etc. We have a lot of that out here on this outer coast, a lot of freshwater influences as well. I'm going to show you some of the species that we manage, and then we'll get into a little closer discussion on the potential for these forecasting models and how they work with them. Let's see if I can make this go. Aha, here we go. So we've mentioned a couple of these already, the Pacific razor clams, Dungeness crab, but we also harvest sardines near Grays Harbor and offshore as well. We harvest sablefish, halibut. We harvest, of course, salmon and steelhead as well. The Quinault blueback salmon, you'll note in that picture there is a sockeye, species of sockeye that's very specific, genetically distinct, and uses the Quinault River and the Lake Quinault and the upper river as part of its habitat. But all of these species of fish depend upon not just the riverine environments, but obviously that ocean environment and the productivity offshore, especially during outmigration in their juvenile stages, especially when they're looking for small edible critters to forage on as they're heading their way north to grow larger in the Gulf of Alaska and elsewhere. Some of the species that are particularly vulnerable to OA, we suspect, and we certainly are finding more and more research to support this, are the shellfish species that we manage out here. Dungeness crab has been alluded to already in the previous discussions, presentations. And we know that there are documented impacts on Dungeness crab currently under certain saturation states of aragonite and pH scenarios. The Dungeness crab fishery to the Quinault Nation is extremely important. It's a very, very valuable fishery to us and has been for some time, supports a large fleet of vessels in Westport, Washington, and is something that we really want to make sure that we are managing properly for now and into the future. So anything that helps us with managing that better and currently and into the future is something that we're very interested in, obviously. So both Live Ocean and JScope have strong potential to help us in our management of that species. And then the Pacific razor clam as well. It inhabits the sandy beaches up and down the Washington coast, but we co-manage or manage the beaches north of Grays Harbor in particular. And that species may be more at risk than we know at this point, and we're very concerned about it because of its spawning during the late spring, early summertime, and the exposure to the larvae in the water column from 5 to 16 weeks, depending on conditions. And during the summer months, when a lot of the activity that's we've been discussing earlier has been occurring, including hypoxia events in particular, and potentially associated OA as well. So we just don't know about a lot of the impacts that are occurring to these species currently. And a lot of this is guesswork. We know that we've been relatively lucky in some respects in that these species have had up and down years of abundance, but in reality, we don't know what's been going on in that great black box of the ocean out there. And we really want to thank these folks here that are beginning to shed some light on that black box. We've, for years, have wondered what would have happened to salmon when they enter the water out there, and are they able to find the food that they need? We've wondered for years whether, a big spawn of razor clams are surviving well in the ocean out there, and will they survive long enough to make it back into shore and settle into the sand? And of course, crab, are they surviving out there as well? So these species are of extreme importance to us, and the work being done by Parker, Samantha, Jan, and others is extremely important as well for those reasons. As for the utility of these models for helping us out here, let's see if I want to change to this slide or not. I do want to mention juvenile salmon prey as well. Obviously, these are critters of concern as well. Pteropods we've touched upon earlier, and with the well-documented impacts on these food sources. Zooplankton though as well out there, the different types of copepods and larval animals that are available and krill that are available for salmon as well. So what's going on to the ecosystem as a whole, and how is that impacting our fish that are so important to the Quinault Nation? One thing that we talked about earlier was the harmful algal bloom bulletin. Parker talked about it as part of the live ocean model, and he had mentioned that the forecasting ability to predict surface movement of harmful algal blooms, particularly pseudonychia blooms that produce domoic acid and can cause problems with our razor clams and our Dungeness crab out here. The HAB bulletin has been a work that has developed over the years with the cooperation of the managers out here on the coast and the scientists there at UW and the Science Center and elsewhere. And that bulletin now has taken the form of a predictive model that we can look at, and basically it's kind of a green light, yellow light, red light type of forecast. It's something I just wanted to mention, in that a lot of the forecasting ability being brought forward by JScope through NANOOS, the live ocean through NANOOS, is fantastic. But one of the things we might suggest as managers is being able to summarize this data into something that tells managers out here to be on the lookout. We know something definitive, or it looks pretty green for the time being, that type of forecasting ability. Because what happens is we're awful busy, all of us are, and a lot of times we don't find ourselves, referring back to the pages and maybe not seeing the emails in time. So if we had a regular bulletin that was sent out from these models, that might be one improvement I could suggest. Another would be resolution. Obviously, that's something managers all want. The box that I showed everybody previously for our management and our treaty rights for the Quinault Nation is where we manage, so we really need to have information that's finally defined for those areas, and we've been working with the people on this call and others on doing just that, but just want to reiterate that. And of course, as Samantha noted in one of her last slides there, the continuing need for long-term monitoring information out here in order to really continue to gain the information we need to improve these models and to improve our on-the-ground ground truthing of what's actually going on out here. So all of those things as well. We do want to talk quickly about hypoxia. I know we're probably running out of time, so I want to quickly mention, though, that we on the Quinault Indian Nation reservation beaches out here have been at the center of many of these seasonal hypoxia events that have been occurring since approximately 2006 on. By that I mean those are the events that have shown mortalities of fish and shellfish on the beaches of the Quinault Reservation. That we've been kind of ground zero for a lot of these events where they've come all the way into shore. Though we know that shelf hypoxia has been occurring out there up and down the Washington coast and the Oregon coast as well, obviously. We have been seeing these really, really nasty scenes of dead animals on our beaches that have frightened many of our tribal members that have been out walking these beaches over time. And we know about the intrinsic link, where we're learning, I should say, about the intrinsic link between low oxygen and ocean acidification. And these, we are very, very deeply concerned about the future of our ecosystems out here and what's going on. So this type of research, these types of models are something that we're keeping a close eye on in order to better protect and manage these resources. With that, I'll just say thanks and turn it back over to Jan, because I want to make sure that we have time for questions from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate that that overview, and then also your insights on how to make things better. And so, with the remainder of our time, what I'd like to do is ask some questions that the audience has been contributing. I'm trying to do two things at once, and when I have a cold, that doesn't work so well. Joe, do you know any literature? Have you heard anything on whether razor clam larvae are affected by OA? Have you seen anything on that?
Thanks for asking, Jen. No, and that's something we've been pushing for some time. I believe that there's been some testing. I know there's been at least we've had requests for gathering some gravid razor clams and doing some lab spawning of them to test, but I have not heard anything further than that.
Yeah, you know, when the Washington OA Center first sent out our request for proposals, we asked for some work on razor clams and got no replies. So there's a continual plea from folks like Joe and myself to the biologists that might be on the line to do some more work on razor clam larvae. So that would be great. All right. We have a question from Peter Rhines, who asks, and this is probably to either Sam or Parker, how much modeling activity to marry higher resolution estuary coverage to the coastal models?
Sam, should I take this? Okay, this is Parker MacCready. Yeah, that's definitely the focus of the modeling work that I do is all about connecting the coastal ocean and the estuarine waters, and that's because the waters interact. And I think the next grid I'm developing, that last slide in my presentation, is definitely aimed at essentially providing an ongoing framework that does a good enough job inside the Salish Sea that it is then something you can do much higher resolution nesting within, so that you could, in fact, right now I'm actively developing a very high resolution nest for Hood Canal for some observational work we're doing in April there, sort of down to 50-meter scale. And I think there are several groups, actually myself, people at PNNL, and also Susan Allen's group at iOS are all actively modeling at relatively high resolution inside the Salish Sea.
Thank you, appreciate that. Here is a question from Dick Seeley, and I invite everybody else, if you have questions for this group of three, please type them in, because we do have time. Dick says, what is involved with extending the forecast model to longer term predictions for the next several decades?
Yeah, so I think Parker, is it okay if I start and you can add something to it? Is that all right?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So longer term forecasts beyond seasonal there's a gap in our knowledge about the mechanisms that drive predictability past seasonal timescales into the interannual to decadal. There's a lot of work going on in decadal timescales right now, but we certainly have skill in forecasting and projecting out 100 years. So that's why I said it's a gap. So it goes between the seasonal, you know, and then we don't have skill again until out at 100 years. There's some places that are showing now that there is skill decadally, and again, that's like work that's in progress and experimental and being highly researched. And so I think that that's probably the next time, time horizon that we can expect to see forecasts and projections on. Although I know that that there's also forecasts people are working on to try to get to beyond the 9 months, beyond a year, you know. And so those are boundaries that we are pushing as scientists, and hopefully we'll get to see something sooner. I mean, seasonally, the mechanisms come from our predictability for ENSO. So if when there's a strong El Nino or La Nina event in the equatorial Pacific, there's mechanisms that have been identified that provide through teleconnections that provide us with our predictive skill on the seasonal timescales. And so that's an example of the kind of work that's being investigated now beyond that time horizon.
Thank you, Samantha. Parker, anything to add?
Sure. I would just make one more comment about the climate timescales, and this is more in reference to the 100-year type of timescales. The approach there is that we, instead of nesting our models inside of something like HICOM, we nest them inside global climate models, which do run to much, they run 100 years into the future, and there's a variety of choices about what you nest inside. The big issue with that is that the resolution of those global climate models is very coarse, something like a degree or 100 kilometers horizontally in the ocean. And so they really don't resolve the coastal ocean at all. And so connecting our very highly resolved coastal models to them actually introduces significant errors or biases, because they're just not as good as the 10-kilometer HICOM model, for example, just in their ability to represent the coastal ocean. That's a major limitation right now. I think it's something that will not be a limitation 10 years from now. That is, global climate models will have a fine enough grid, because they're running on bigger computers, to resolve the coastal ocean well enough for our regional models to make use of them. And that's, again, in the context of predicting what will Puget Sound look like 100 years from now, not the kind of seasonal forecasting Sam mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank each of the three of you again for your presentation and sharing your perspectives. And I want to just iterate how, I'm really proud to be part of this CCAN group where people are sharing this information, where we're coming together and really, it seems like when I started being an oceanographer, it was more about, this research project, right? And it had a stop-start. And now I think we're really building together meaningful knowledge about the environment and how it's changing and how people can then utilize that information. And so with that, I want to start drawing this to a close and to let you know that a video archive and PDF of this webinar will be available on the CCAN website at the workshop page, and to contact Diane Pleschner-Steele, whose email address you see there, with any questions about CCAN. Also, Shallon typed out the email of herself, me, Parker, Sam, and Joe, so you can get in touch with any of us if you have any additional questions. And then what I want to direct your attention to is that there will be another one of these. coming up on February 8th, and it's going to be a summary of a workshop on monitoring for acidification threats in West Coast estuaries, a San Francisco Bay case study. And so you'll be hearing that as well. And as always, we welcome any feedback that you might have, further suggestions, further questions, or any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see in this webinar series. Again, I want to thank Terry King for really coming together and making all of us think about how to start this series again and to actually get stuff on the books, because we do have a schedule, but we welcome any additional ideas. So thanks again to our speakers for taking the time to offer their expertise and perspectives about OA-related forecasts in the Pacific Northwest. Another shout out to Shallon for getting us all organized. And thank you to you all for taking the time to join us. And I am going to draw this to a close. This is the end of the session. Thanks for participating. Bye.